Imagine working tirelessly, year after year, clocking in on time, climbing the ladder, taking pride in the stability your paycheck brings, and still never feeling truly secure. What if I told you that the very system designed to reward diligence, ambition, and loyalty is quietly working against most people, not because of laziness, but because of invisible forces that shape wealth, opportunity, and access? Behind the neat spreadsheets, the retirement accounts, the mortgages, there are patterns most never see. Tiny decisions, compounded over decades, economic pressures most consider normal, a rising tide that seems to lift all boats, yet leaves so many anchored in place. Taxes, inflation, corporate incentives, housing markets, and the silent erosion of wages versus living costs, all of it moves in rhythms few recognize, while families, just like yours, navigate the currents unaware that the rules are stacked subtly, persistently against them. What if a single missed opportunity, a choice made under pressure, a hidden fee, or a small systemic bias could ripple across generations, quietly shaping financial destiny? Consider the story of a family that believed a good job was enough, only to discover that it was just the beginning of a maze that stretches back decades across homes, neighborhoods, and unspoken rules that they never learned in school. As we follow them, layer by layer, we will uncover how wealth, or the lack of it, is not just about money, but about timing, culture, psychology, and the hidden mechanics of the system itself. And by the end, you'll see why most people can't build wealth, even when they try. And maybe, just maybe, what can be done differently? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us, because the truth behind the numbers is far more compelling than most realize. It begins in a quiet suburb just outside Detroit in the spring of 1974. The sun fell in soft gold across the manicured lawns, glinting off the cars parked in neat rows along the streets. Inside one of these houses, a man named Robert Whitaker returned from his shift at the auto plant, shirt streaked with sweat, hands rough from decades of manual labor. He carried with him not just fatigue, but a quiet pride, the pride of someone who believed that steady work, discipline, and a family-first mentality would secure a future. Robert's wife, Marjorie, was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes and humming a tune from the radio. Their children played quietly in the living room, oblivious to the unspoken tension that always seemed to hover in these homes, tension that didn't announce itself in argument or anger, but in silent calculation. Can we stretch the dollars far enough this month? Is there enough to fix the furnace? What happens if the car breaks down again? This was not poverty, not in the stark sense, but it was fragile. The Whitakers, like millions of families across America, were living on the edge of what economists would later call the middle-class trap. A place where income is enough to survive, often enough to enjoy occasional comfort, but rarely enough to accumulate real wealth. They didn't yet know that this invisible trap was shaped by decades of policy decisions, rising living costs, and wage stagnation masked behind superficial stability. Robert thought about retirement, sometimes, mostly in abstract terms. He had a pension promised by the union, a 401k was just starting to emerge, but the numbers never quite felt right. He thought of his own father, who had lived through the Depression, and wondered how it was that despite working harder than anyone he knew, he had never left the neighborhood he was born in. He asked himself quietly, almost fearfully, could he do any better? On a Thursday evening, a neighbor, Mr. Carlson, stopped by. He was the first to mention the new development downtown, a small building dedicated to financial planning seminars, promising to teach ordinary people how to grow wealth beyond a paycheck. Many dismissed it as another gimmick, a mirage among the maze of credit card offers and get-rich-quick promises. But something about Carlson's urgency lingered in Robert's mind. He left that night wondering if there was more he could do, if perhaps the rules he assumed were fixed were actually flexible. The next morning, the Whitakers' oldest child, Evelyn, turned 10. Her birthday was modest, celebrated with homemade cake and gifts wrapped in simple paper. Yet even amidst the candles and laughter, Marjorie could not ignore the growing concern etched in Robert's face. It wasn't about Evelyn specifically. It was about the larger question that hovered over all parents in their generation. How could they ensure their children would step into a world of possibility, not limitation? Outside, the streets buzzed with the usual traffic, the auto plants humming like living organisms. Unemployment had dipped slightly in the region, but wage growth had barely kept pace with inflation, and rising costs in housing, healthcare, and education quietly eroded any surplus. Robert's paycheck, which had once felt like security, now seemed like a fragile waft drifting through an unpredictable current. The Whittakers were not poor, but they were not building wealth, not in any real, lasting sense. One evening, Robert and Marjorie sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills. The numbers stared back at them, stubborn and unforgiving. Utilities, rent, groceries, the little discretionary spending they allowed themselves was a temporary illusion. Yet, as Robert ran his finger along the columns of figures, he noticed patterns he had never recognized before. Fees for late payments, small hidden charges that seemed trivial individually, but compounded over months and years, became invisible drains on income. Marjorie, quiet, observed him. Do you think it'll ever get better?" she asked softly. Her voice carried the weight of years of caution, the unspoken knowledge that the American dream often promised more than it delivered. Robert didn't answer immediately. He knew she was right to ask, and yet he also knew that surrender was not an option. Every hour he worked, every careful calculation he made, was a step in a long, slow journey towards security, though the destination remained uncertain. The Whittakers weren't alone in this struggle. Across America, families in similar towns, suburbs and cities were feeling the same invisible pressures. Wage stagnation, housing costs outpacing incomes, credit traps disguised as convenience. Many believed that a good job was enough. Many were wrong. Many were wrong. They had no way of knowing that the very systems they trusted, employers, banks, government programs, were quietly structured in ways that rewarded timing, access and knowledge more than effort or morality. It was in this environment of quiet uncertainty and incremental pressure that Robert made a choice that would echo across the family's generations. He decided to attend the seminar downtown, the one Carlson had mentioned. Not because he was desperate, but because something in him, a cautious hope, wanted to understand the invisible currents shaping his life. He didn't know what he would find, but he sensed that knowledge, true knowledge, could be a bridge to something beyond survival. That evening, as he parked his car outside the seminar hall, the streetlights flickering against the glass windows, a strange unease settled over him. The building was modest, not imposing. Inside, ordinary people filled the rows of chairs, eyes fixed on charts and graphs, presentations explaining things that had never been explained in his school or workplace. Taxes, compound interest, hidden fees, investment traps, the subtle advantages of timing and leverage. The information was overwhelming yet precise, almost surgical. And then, as Robert scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture every insight, he noticed a figure at the back of the room, someone who seemed almost out of place, observing everyone quietly, nodding in understanding. Their gaze met briefly. A chill ran down his spine, a feeling that whatever path he was on, he was not the only one navigating it, and that there were forces far larger, far older, quietly shaping the outcomes of ordinary lives like his. He left the building that night with his notebook full, head spinning, heart heavy with both hope and fear. As he walked to his car, he didn't know it yet, but the choices he would make in the next days, weeks and months would set the stage for a struggle that would span decades, affecting not only his own wealth, but the financial destiny of his children and perhaps, Budi, the generations after them. And somewhere in the darkness, the figure from the back of the seminar watched and waited. Robert's next decision, whether to trust the lessons he had learned or continue life as usual, would not only test his understanding of money, but reveal how deep the system's invisible forces really went. The night air was crisp as Robert slid into his car, notebook resting on the passenger seat. Every streetlight seemed sharper, every shadow more deliberate. He kept thinking of that figure in the seminar, the quiet observer whose gaze had unsettled him, the kind of presence that hints at understanding far beyond your own. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a class about money. It was a doorway. The next morning, the Whittaker household followed its usual rhythm. Marjorie prepared breakfast, Evelyn argued with her younger brother over cereal, and Robert sipped coffee, eyes still on the seminar notes. Each page was a revelation, compound interest not as a distant theory, but as a mechanism for creating generational advantage. The hidden costs in banking practices, the ways middle-class families unwittingly surrendered wealth to fees, taxes, and consumer traps. It all felt like a secret map, one few would ever see. Robert's first move was simple, almost mundane. He created a ledger for their family finances. Not the casual one with doodles and reminders, but a strict, disciplined record. Every dollar in, every dollar out. Utilities, groceries, insurance, even small discretionary purchases, everything was catalogued. As he wrote, he began to notice patterns he had never seen before. The silent bleed of convenience, the subtle erosion of earnings by monthly subscriptions and unnecessary fees. He shared the ledger with Marjorie, whose eyes widened at the precision. "It's all in black and white," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how much we were losing without noticing." Robert nodded. "It's like someone gave us a magnifying glass, a magnifying glass. We can see it now, all of it." But awareness was only the first step. The Whitakers were still living paycheck to paycheck, their wages stable but unremarkable. And as Robert soon realized, simply knowing the problem didn't solve it. He began to test strategies from the seminar, small investments, careful timing of bills to avoid fees, understanding the nuances of interest rates on loans. But every choice revealed the invisible friction inherent in the system. A late mortgage payment incurred a penalty, even when unintentional. A credit card seemed convenient until the interest compounded faster than expected. Meanwhile, the children continued to grow, oblivious to the calculations unfolding around them. Evelyn showed a sharp mind for numbers, quickly picking up her father's techniques of comparing costs, analyzing trends, and questioning assumptions. Robert began teaching her small lessons, without framing them as lessons, simply showing her how to track money, how to see patterns, how to anticipate the hidden consequences of choices. He imagined a future where she might navigate these forces with more clarity than he had. Yet, even with diligence, the Whitakers felt the subtle weight of external pressures. In 1975, Detroit's auto industry wavered under oil crises and shifting global markets. Plant layoffs were announced across the city. Robert watched colleagues, friends, neighbors lose stability in an instant, and he realized something chilling. No matter how careful you were, external forces could sweep away years of labor in moments. Security was an illusion, and wealth, real, enduring wealth, required more than work ethic. It demanded insight, timing, and sometimes luck. Robert began to meet others who had attended similar seminars. They exchanged strategies quietly in diners and small meeting rooms, discussing nuances of tax law, investment timing, and the psychology of spending. It was during one of these conversations that he first heard about the power of leverage, not just in real estate or stocks, but in life itself. How certain families, by understanding credit, timing, and opportunity, could amplify their small earnings into lasting wealth, while others, equally industrious, remained trapped in cycles of stability without growth. One evening, Marjorie confronted him gently. Robert, I see what you're trying to do. I want to support you. But are we risking too much?" He paused. The risk was real. Every financial maneuver carried the potential for loss, but for the first time, Robert felt a sense of purpose beyond survival. We're not just surviving," he said. We're trying to understand the currents so our family can navigate them better. If we do this right, maybe Evelyn, maybe even the younger ones won't have to struggle the way we do." The first major test came with the house itself. The Whitakers had bought their home with a conventional mortgage, fixed payments, modest interest. But Robert, inspired by strategies from the seminar, began exploring the idea of leveraging equity, restructuring debt, and cautiously investing surplus funds in bonds and mutual funds. Each decision carried invisible pressure. Misstep, and they could lose what little stability they had. Yet every careful choice seemed to magnify small advantages, giving them incremental control over what had previously felt uncontrollable. By 1977, Robert's discipline began showing tangible results. The ledger revealed surplus funds that had been hidden in plain sight, compounded by judicious investments. They were still far from wealthy, far from the dreams whispered about in magazines or seminars, but they were moving differently than most families. They were learning the quiet truth that wealth wasn't a single destination. It was a series of informed choices compounded over time, protected against both visible and invisible risks. Yet the system's resistance was persistent. Small surprises, often disguised as routine occurrences, threatened to undo months of careful planning. A sudden repair bill, a minor health expense, or a change in credit terms, these weren't disasters in isolation. But they reminded Robert that every step towards security was subject to forces beyond his control. He began to understand the psychological toll as well. The constant awareness, the calculation of risk, the tension between present comfort and future gain. Marjorie, though supportive, occasionally recoiled from the intensity. "I don't want us living in fear of every bill," she said. But Robert countered quietly. "It's not fear, it's understanding." Then, in late 1978, the unthinkable happened. A letter arrived from the union. The pension fund, once considered rock solid, had suffered unexpected losses. Future benefits would be reduced. What he uncovered next would challenge everything he believed about stability, trust, and the true path to building wealth. The following morning, Robert could barely eat breakfast. Marjorie noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes traced the edges of the table rather than meet hers. Evelyn tugged at his sleeve, asking about school projects, her bright curiosity a sharp contrast to the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He forced a smile, but inside his mind raced, replaying the voice on the phone. The words, discrepancies and unusual activity, reverberating over and over. He drove to work with the notebook on the passenger seat, its pages a roadmap of lessons learned, calculations, and strategies. Each investment, each carefully timed payment had been executed with precision. And yet now, there was the unsettling sense that unseen mechanisms beyond the seminar lessons or his own diligence were scrutinizing his life. Something about the timing, the method, the choices he had made had triggered a reaction. At the plant, the hum of machinery normally comforted him, grounding him in the rhythm of his labor. Today it sounded different, tense, uneasy. Colleagues whispered in low tones about audits, mysterious letters, and financial troubles hitting seemingly random families. It was as if the invisible system he had only begun to understand was signaling its presence, a reminder that diligence alone could not guarantee safety. Robert decided to confront the matter head-on. That afternoon, he scheduled a meeting with the bank representative who had overseen his accounts. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and antiseptic, the walls lined with plaques proclaiming stability and trust. He handed over his ledger, pointing to every entry, every calculated investment. The representative's eyes flicked across the pages with practiced detachment, but Robert could sense the curiosity behind the professionalism. "Mr. Whitaker," the woman began slowly, "these are thorough records. I haven't seen a ledger maintained this meticulously in years, but some transactions, small but frequent, have triggered alerts in our monitoring system. Nothing illegal, but unusual enough to warrant a closer look." Robert swallowed hard. "I assure you, everything is above board. Every investment, every transfer is intentional. I'm trying to understand the system, not exploit it." Her lips tightened, and she nodded. "I understand. But you should know, the system is not designed to favor meticulousness alone. It's designed to protect the institutions first. Sometimes even diligence can appear anomalous." The words hung in the air. Protect the institutions first, not the families. Robert left the office with a new understanding. The invisible currents were not only indifferent, they were self-preserving. His next moves had to be precise, careful, almost surgical. There could be no error. Back home, he shared the conversation with Marjorie. She listened quietly, the lines on her face deepening. "So even when we do everything right, the system can still push back?" "Yes," Robert said softly. "But now we know. Now we can navigate it." And navigate he did. Over the next months, Robert refined every aspect of his family's financial life. He diversified accounts, minimized fees, leveraged small investment opportunities, and started teaching Evelyn more advanced principles. The difference between nominal and real interest, the subtle impact of inflation, the strategic timing of debt repayment. She absorbed it eagerly, asking questions that revealed a mind far beyond her 10 years. Then came the opportunity that would define the family's trajectory. A small piece of property became available on the outskirts of Detroit, a neglected house undervalued in a neighborhood slowly rising due to economic shifts. Most families overlooked it, deterred by minor repairs and a location just outside the city's immediate comfort zones. But Robert saw potential, not just for immediate income, but as a lesson in leverage, patience, and strategic risk. He presented the idea to Marjorie carefully, emphasizing both risk and potential reward. Her brow furrowed. Robert, this could go wrong. A bad purchase could set us back years. Why no, he said. But it could also teach us what the system rewards: knowledge, timing, and courage. And it's controlled risk, not blind speculation. After long discussions, they agreed to proceed. The purchase was painstakingly planned. Careful loans, calculated renovations, strategic tax considerations, and attention to local economic trends. The Whitakers began transforming the property, learning on the job about contractors, materials, and the subtleties of neighborhood dynamics. It was both exhilarating and exhausting, a crucible in which their lessons were tested against real-world variables. The project revealed another truth. Wealth accumulation was never just about numbers on a page. It was about human judgment, negotiation, and observation. Every decision, from hiring a painter to choosing paint colors to timing the listing, carried consequences. The system was indifferent to effort or good intentions. It responded to decisions, timing, and leverage. Evelyn, increasingly involved, became an unofficial apprentice. She calculated potential returns, tracked expenses, and questioned assumptions with precision. Robert recognized in her a rare ability to internalize both the mechanics of money and the psychology behind choices. For the first time, he imagined that his children could not only survive in this system but potentially thrive in ways he never had. By late 1979, the house was complete. Its value had increased modestly, but enough to demonstrate a principle. Careful, informed action could create tangible advantage, even against a system that seemed predisposed to favor institutions over families. The Whitakers felt a cautious sense of empowerment. They weren't wealthy yet, but they were learning to navigate forces that most of their neighbors never even noticed. Then came a letter that chilled Robert to the bone. It was from a local inspector, noting discrepancies in permits and previous renovations. Rectify immediately, it read, or face fines and potential legal action. The tone was neutral, bureaucratic, but its implications were clear. A single oversight, something minor, could erase months of effort, destabilize finances, and send a family once again into uncertainty. Robert sat in silence that night, Marjorie beside him, Evelyn asleep in the next room. The invisible currents were real and relentless. They did not favor diligence alone. They punished error, rewarded insight, and demanded constant vigilance. He called the inspector the next morning, calmly explaining the situation, presenting all documentation. Hours passed on the phone, minutes stretching into tension-filled hours. Finally, the inspector relented. No penalties but a warning: maintain careful records or the system will enforce consequences without discretion. That evening, Robert reflected on the lesson. Knowledge and diligence provided a shield, but the system remained indifferent. It was not hostile, just self-preserving, rewarding those who understood it and punishing those who did not. And even understanding it was not enough. One had to act, consistently and strategically, against invisible forces moving constantly in the background. The children continued to absorb these lessons, unknowingly shaping their own understanding of money and risk. Evelyn's questions grew sharper. Why do some families succeed while others with the same income fail? Robert answered with care, weaving in lessons of timing, leverage, opportunity, and the subtle advantages hidden in networks and access. A few glanced with subtle resentment, unaware of the precise calculations that had guided the project. Robert realized that human psychology was as much a part of wealth creation as numbers, envy, complacency, and perception all shaped opportunity. Then the first external challenge arrived. A contractor, whom they had relied on for renovations, demanded payment for work allegedly completed beyond the original scope. The amount was small in absolute terms, but significant relative to their carefully managed budget. Robert knew the system would not intervene automatically. Disputes required negotiation, strategy, and often legal knowledge. He took a deep breath, gathered his records, and scheduled a meeting. The contractor arrived, confident and slightly hostile. Robert presented the ledger, itemizing every payment, every agreement, every conversation. Tension filled the room as figures were compared and recalculated. The contractor hesitated, realizing the Whitakers' meticulous documentation left little room for dispute. With a terse nod, he withdrew the claim. Robert exhaled, aware that every victory came with a reminder. Even minor missteps could trigger cascading consequences. Back at home, he shared the experience with Marjorie. "It's not just the money," he said. "It's understanding the forces that act quietly, invisibly, the ways they influence people, markets, even our own decisions." The lesson extended to the children, who watched silently as their parents navigated negotiations with calm precision. Evelyn began to recognize patterns of behavior: when to assert, when to wait, when to trust documentation over words. These subtleties, invisible to most, were shaping her understanding of risk, leverage, and strategic advantage. By spring of 1981, the Whitakers had learned to anticipate minor disruptions: a rise in property taxes, a sudden increase in material costs, changes in banking fees. All were absorbed with calculated adjustments. The family's balance sheet, once fragile, now demonstrated incremental resilience. But Robert understood the truth. Resilience did not equal immunity. The system could shift in ways they could not predict, and every calculated move remained subject to external scrutiny. It was during this period that Robert began to notice patterns beyond his household. Across the neighborhood, families who appeared to have similar incomes struggled to accumulate savings. Some borrowed at higher rates, often unknowingly paying premiums that eroded wealth. Others invested in schemes that promised fast returns but delivered losses. The pattern was clear. The difference between accumulation and stagnation was rarely diligence alone. It was awareness, timing, and access to knowledge that most never acquired. Robert documented his observations meticulously. He began drafting a set of informal principles, a map of the hidden mechanics that governed wealth accumulation in their environment. It was part journal, part ledger, part strategy guide, a framework that he intended to pass down to the children, not as financial instruction alone, but as a lens through which to interpret the world. Then came a more subtle form of pressure. A neighbour, casually but pointedly, began questioning Robert's activities. "You've been busy with that house, sir," the man said one afternoon, leaning on the fence. "Interesting investments for someone with a regular job. Ever worry about consequences?" Robert recognised the tone. It wasn't threat, exactly. It was observation, curiosity, and perhaps envy, all elements of the social dynamics that shaped opportunity. He replied politely, without revealing strategy or intent. Yet he knew that every visible success drew attention, scrutiny, and occasionally subtle resistance. The currents had noticed, and they responded not with direct action, but through social and economic friction, forcing adaptation and vigilance. Over the next year, Robert expanded his approach. Every choice now mattered in ways that could echo across decades, shaping not only immediate outcomes, but generational destiny. He hung up the phone, staring out the window at the snow-dusted streets. Marjorie entered quietly, sensing the tension. "It's more than just finances now, isn't it?" she asked softly. "Yes," Robert said. "It's the system itself. And we're inside it now, whether we like it or not." He knew, with a gravity that settled deep in his chest, that the next phase of their journey would demand not only financial acumen, but courage, foresight, and the ability to anticipate the invisible currents that governed opportunity, stability, and risk. The Whitakers had reached a pivotal point. They had learned to navigate subtle forces, accumulate advantage, and teach the next generation, but now the system's attention had turned toward them. What would follow would test every lesson they had learned, and the outcomes would ripple across the family's future in ways they could not yet imagine. Spring of 1984 arrived with the promise of warmth and growth, yet for the Whitakers, every season brought both opportunity and vigilance. Robert had learned that success was not a static achievement, but a constant negotiation with the invisible forces that shaped the financial and social landscapes. The neighbourhood had begun to notice their property, the subtle improvements, and the careful timing of every renovation. Some whispered admiration, others suspicion, but all signals were data to Robert, and every observation could inform the next move. The first major external challenge of the season came unexpectedly. A real estate developer expressed interest in a neighboring property, one that had been quietly accumulating value. The developer's intentions were opaque. Promises of partnership were laced with subtle pressure, insinuations of urgency, and veiled threats of competitive advantage. Most families would have been intimidated or worse, coerced into hasty decisions. Robert, however, approached the situation as he had learned, with documentation, timing, and strategic patience. He met with the developer in a modest office downtown, the walls lined with maps and plans of proposed constructions. Robert laid out the Whitakers' position, detailing past investments, property improvements, and the legal frameworks governing the neighborhood. The developer's smile was polite but measured, revealing nothing. It became immediately clear. Leverage was more than numbers. It was clarity, preparation, and the quiet confidence that knowledge imparts. Returning home that evening, Robert shared the details with Marjorie and Evelyn. "It's not just about the money," he explained. "It's about perception, influence, and timing. We have to act carefully or risk losing control of the situation." Evelyn, now 13, absorbed the lesson with a maturity that both impressed and unsettled her parents. She had learned to anticipate behavior, recognize subtle cues, and understand that opportunity and risk often arrived intertwined. The Whitakers family discussions had evolved from simple financial management to strategic planning, a curriculum born of lived experience rather than textbook. By summer, Robert had begun experimenting with another principle: diversification. The property project had provided insight into leverage and timing, but it was only one layer. Savings accounts, small-scale investments in bonds, and cautiously selected mutual funds became additional streams, each chosen for risk mitigation, compounding potential, and strategic advantage. The ledger grew more complex, yet more insightful. Patterns emerged that revealed the subtle advantages of informed action over passive compliance. However, external pressures persisted. The city began implementing stricter codes on renovations, zoning changes, and property valuations. Some neighbours reacted with frustration, seeing the Whitakers' meticulous compliance as unnecessary. Others, threatened by their relative advantage, began spreading rumours, questioning Robert's intentions and his ability to manage risk responsibly. It was an early glimpse of a truth he had only theorized. In systems that reward knowledge and action, social friction often follows. One evening, as the family gathered around the kitchen table, a local banker arrived unexpectedly. He presented a document outlining new regulations and potential implications for the Whitakers' property and investments. The conversation was civil, but Robert sensed the undercurrent: scrutiny, assessment, and the quiet reinforcement of systemic control. Every move, every calculated advantage was now observed, evaluated, and potentially challenged. Robert's response was deliberate. He reviewed every transaction, every document, every step in the property's development. Every detail was cross-checked against municipal regulations, legal frameworks, and financial strategy. The process was exhausting, yet necessary. The Whitakers had learned that wealth accumulation required not just intelligence and discipline, but vigilance, precision, and an acute awareness of invisible oversight. Meanwhile, Evelyn's education accelerated. She learned to model potential outcomes, assess risk versus reward, and understand the psychology of markets, neighbors, and institutions. Her questions became more complex. Why do some families consistently anticipate changes, while others react late and lose advantage? Robert replied patiently, emphasizing patterns, timing, and leverage, the invisible currents that determined outcomes more than raw effort alone. By 1985, the Whitakers' efforts began to yield tangible results. Their property value increased steadily, investments generated modest but consistent returns, and their financial stability provided a foundation for further strategic choices. Yet Robert understood that stability was never guaranteed. The system was indifferent to individual diligence. It rewarded insight, timing, and adaptability. Even small errors could cascade, erasing months or years of progress. The next test came from an unexpected quarter, a local dispute over property boundaries. A neighbor claimed that part of the Whitakers' land encroached on their property. The claim was minor, almost trivial, yet it carried significant implications: legal fees, potential delays in future projects, and the psychological toll of confrontation. Robert approached the issue methodically. He consulted maps, reviewed historical records, and engaged a mediator. Every step was deliberate, every action documented, every decision informed by a deep understanding of precedent and consequence. As the negotiation unfolded, Evelyn observed closely. She learned the subtle art of strategic patience, when to assert, when to yield, and when to rely on documented evidence rather than emotion. Robert recognized that these experiences were forming the foundation for a generational understanding of wealth, not merely as money, but as knowledge, strategy, and resilience. By late 1986, the Whitakers had established a rhythm of calculated advancement. Their financial position was secure enough to withstand minor setbacks, yet fragile enough to require constant vigilance. Robert had begun teaching Evelyn about the power of compound advantage, the long-term effects of small, consistent actions, and the importance of understanding both visible and invisible forces in any system. Then came the most revealing challenge yet: a sudden audit of their property and accounts by municipal authorities. The audit was thorough, probing, and intimidating. It tested every principle the Whitakers had cultivated: diligence, documentation, timing, and strategic patience. Robert spent days preparing, cross-referencing every record, anticipating every question, and rehearsing explanation. Marjorie supported him quietly, ensuring the household maintained its routine, while Evelyn absorbed the process with acute observation. When the auditors arrived, Robert presented the ledger, historical records, and documented correspondence with contractors, banks, and city offices. The process was tense, meticulous, and exhaustive. Hours stretched into days, and each moment tested the family's patience, knowledge, and composure. Ultimately, the audit concluded without penalty. The authorities acknowledged compliance, precision, and thorough documentation. The Whitakers had navigated the scrutiny successfully, but the lesson was clear: the system would always challenge advantage, whether subtle or overt. Compliance, vigilance, and informed action were necessary, but not sufficient. Success required continuous awareness of external forces, and the humility to recognize that advantage often attracts attention. Robert reflected on the process late at night. He realized that real wealth was never simply a matter of income or effort. It was strategy, observation, timing, and resilience in the face of scrutiny. It was teaching the next generation to perceive patterns, anticipate disruption, and leverage opportunity while managing risk. The Whitakers' journey was only beginning, but the framework they had built, knowledge, discipline, and vigilance, would shape not only their immediate stability, but the trajectory of future generations. And yet, even as the family celebrated this hard-won victory, the invisible currents continued to shift. New regulations, economic fluctuations, and subtle social pressures loomed on the horizon. The system that had tested them once would test them again. Robert understood that the Whitakers were now visible participants in a broader, relentless mechanism, one that rewarded insight, punished error, and shaped destinies across time. Just as the Whitakers began to feel secure, a new development emerged, one that would challenge every lesson Robert had taught his children, test their vigilance, and threaten to disrupt the careful balance they had achieved. The next phase of their journey would reveal how fragile advantage could be, even when carefully constructed, and how the invisible currents always demanded respect. The early morning of 1987 arrived with a tense quiet. Robert sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open, its pages dense with numbers, notes, and projections. Marjorie poured coffee, watching him closely. Evelyn, now 15, moved silently, aware that something had shifted. The new development Robert had anticipated in theory had finally manifested, a challenge that would test every principle they had cultivated over the past decade. The letter arrived unexpectedly, stamped official, its content terse and authoritative. A neighbouring developer had filed a formal objection regarding zoning boundaries, claiming potential violations and challenging some of the Whitakers' recent renovations. While the claims were technically minor, they were framed to provoke delay, scrutiny, and administrative review. Any misstep could result in fines, costly adjustments, or worse, loss of leverage in a neighbourhood increasingly recognised for rising property values. Robert read the letter 3 times before speaking. "It's designed to pressure us, to test every system we've built," he said quietly. Marjorie placed a hand on his arm. Can we handle it?" she asked. "We've been meticulous. We've done everything right." "Yes," he said, though the word carried the weight of careful calculation. "But right is only part of the equation. This is about resilience, strategy, and observation. Every advantage we've built is now under scrutiny." The next few days became a controlled frenzy. Robert contacted legal advisors, reviewed the original construction permits, cross-referenced contractor records, and consulted city planning documents. Every detail mattered: dates, signatures, material specifications, even minor communications that could validate the family's compliance. For Robert, this was both a test and a reaffirmation of everything he had learned. Wealth, stability, and opportunity were inseparable from vigilance and precision. Evelyn observed closely, absorbing lessons that extended far beyond finance. She learned to recognize the interplay between rules, human behavior, and systemic forces, the subtle ways in which attention could be drawn, advantage questioned, and outcomes shaped. For the first time, she began to see that the invisible currents Robert had spoken about were not theoretical. They were real, influencing events with quiet, relentless logic. By midweek, the Whitakers had assembled a comprehensive response. They scheduled a meeting with city officials, presenting every document, every calculation, and every piece of correspondence related to the property. The discussion was meticulous, the tone polite but formal, and Robert felt the invisible tension pressing. He realized that mastery over numbers alone was insufficient. Understanding perception, timing, and subtle influence was equally essential. After hours of questioning and review, the officials allowed the Whitakers to proceed without modification, acknowledging their compliance but issuing a cautionary reminder: continued diligence would be necessary. The message was clear: advantage attracts scrutiny, and stability requires constant attention. Back home, Robert reflected on the encounter. "It's not a threat," he said to Marjorie and Evelyn. "It's the system asserting itself. We've been recognized as participants, capable of influencing outcomes." But with recognition comes responsibility and visibility. The lesson extended beyond bureaucracy. As the weeks passed, Robert noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once ignored the Whitakers' property began monitoring their activities more closely. Developers subtly adjusted their bids, local contractors became more attentive, and community meetings carried undercurrents of awareness. Advantage, Robert realized, was visible, and visibility, in turn, attracted new pressures, new tests, and new opportunities. By late 1987, the Whitakers had consolidated their position. The property had appreciated, investments continued to generate modest but reliable returns, and the children were increasingly aware of systemic patterns. Evelyn began to apply lessons from their experiences in school projects and social interactions, demonstrating an understanding of leverage, risk, and timing that surprised both Robert and Marjorie, yet the family knew stability was provisional. External factors, the economy, local politics, social dynamics, remained unpredictable. Robert continued to document trends meticulously, noting correlations between municipal actions, market behavior, and neighborly interactions. Each observation was integrated into a broader understanding of systemic currents, forming a knowledge base that could inform strategic choices for years to come. The spring of 1988 brought both opportunity and risk. A small commercial development was proposed nearby, promising to increase neighborhood property values, but also introducing potential competition. Robert analyzed the proposal, evaluating financial projections, zoning implications, and social impact. Every decision carried a risk-reward balance. Act too slowly, and opportunity could be lost. Act too aggressively, and scrutiny could intensify. Evelyn, now 16, joined Robert in reviewing the numbers. Together, they calculated projected appreciation, tax implications, and potential cash flow scenarios. She asked pointed questions. Dad, what if regulations change unexpectedly? What if a contractor fails to comply? Robert smiled, recognizing the subtle growth of her understanding. Then we adapt, he said, but only with knowledge, preparation, and timing. Advantage isn't static. It's a continuous negotiation with invisible forces. By midsummer, the Whitakers had made a cautious investment in the emerging commercial zone. The move was deliberate, conservative, and informed by meticulous calculations. Returns were modest initially, but the decision reinforced a principle Robert had emphasized repeatedly: incremental, informed action compounded over time, building both financial resilience and strategic insight. However, the season brought unforeseen challenges. A minor dispute with a city inspector over property compliance escalated unexpectedly, introducing potential legal fees and administrative delays. While not catastrophic, the situation tested the family's resilience and highlighted the ongoing tension between opportunity and oversight. Robert approached the challenge systematically. Documentation was reviewed, communications recorded, and every action cross-checked against municipal regulations. Marjorie coordinated household activities, ensuring continuity while minimizing stress. Evelyn observed quietly, absorbing lessons in negotiation, procedural compliance, and strategic patience. Eventually, the dispute was resolved without penalty. The Whitakers' careful preparation and meticulous records had neutralized the threat. But the episode reinforced a critical truth: advantage is never uncontested, and the system, while impartial, operates with its own logic, indifferent to effort, intention, or morality. By the end of 1988, the family had weathered scrutiny, navigated opportunity, and cultivated resilience. The property and investments continued to grow steadily, providing a foundation for both present stability and future advantage. Yet Robert remained vigilant. The currents that shaped wealth were not static. They were dynamic, responsive, and often invisible. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Robert reflected aloud. Every advantage we've built, every strategy we've employed, has drawn attention. The system notices diligence, and the moment we appear capable of influencing outcomes, we're observed, tested, and challenged. Marjorie nodded, understanding the subtle tension. "So it's never really safe," she said. "No," Robert replied. "But knowledge, preparation, and timing give us a chance to navigate the currents, to convert challenges into opportunity and pressure into insight." Evelyn, sitting quietly, looked thoughtful. "So it's like a game," she said, "but with real consequences." "Exactly," Robert said, impressed by her insight. "And the better you understand the rules, the currents, and the players, the better your chances of winning, without fooling yourself into thinking the game is ever fair." The family sat in silence for a moment, the weight of lessons learned settling over them. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent, its invisible currents flowing through neighborhoods, offices, and households alike. The Whitakers had learned to observe, anticipate, and act. But the system had already begun shifting again, preparing new tests for those who sought advantage. Then, just as Robert considered closing the ledger for the night, the phone rang. A voice, calm, deliberate, and unfamiliar, spoke. "Mr. Whitaker, we've been monitoring developments in your area. Your activities are noted. Opportunities, decisions, and risks are being observed, and your next moves will be consequential." Robert paused, staring at the receiver. The message was neither threat nor instruction. It was acknowledgement, the system signaling awareness of a family now visible for their competence and foresight. He hung up slowly, heart steady but mind racing. The Whitakers had reached a pivotal stage. Their advantage was real, their insight growing, and their resilience tested. But the currents that governed opportunity were patient, relentless, and indifferent. Every choice, every action, every calculation now carried amplified consequences. The Whitakers had successfully navigated scrutiny, leveraged opportunity, and begun teaching the next generation the principles of resilience and strategy. But the system's acknowledgement marked the beginning of a new phase, one where the stakes would grow higher, visibility would invite challenges, and the family's ability to preserve and expand advantage would be tested as never before. By the spring of 1989, the Whitakers had settled into a rhythm, balancing opportunity with vigilance. The property had appreciated steadily, investments generated modest but consistent returns, and the lessons Robert had painstakingly imparted to Evelyn were now taking root. Yet the system's acknowledgement of their competence, the quiet attention that had begun with letters, calls, and inspections, now loomed larger. Advantage, they realized, always attracted observation. It began subtly, A local contractor, previously reliable, began requesting unusually early payments. Another neighbor questioned minor boundary decisions with pointed, almost antagonistic curiosity. A city planner, normally courteous, now lingered during inspections, asking detailed questions about zoning, renovation permits, and timelines. Robert recognized the pattern. Visibility, once achieved, was rarely passive. It invited pressure, testing not just diligence but judgment, adaptability, and composure. Robert convened a family meeting. Marjorie, calm but attentive, listened as he laid out the challenges. Evelyn, now 16, followed every word with intense focus. "This is no longer about isolated opportunities," Robert explained. "Every choice, every transaction, every interaction is now observed. Advantage attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny requires resilience, strategy, and foresight." The family understood. For the first time, financial literacy extended beyond money. It encompassed perception, influence, and anticipation of human and systemic behavior. They began to document interactions, track responses from neighbors and officials, and integrate observations into planning. Each encounter became data, each decision a potential lever to convert pressure into advantage. During the summer, a new development in the neighborhood heightened the stakes. A small commercial zoning initiative promised to increase property values significantly. Most families saw only the potential profit, unaware of the hidden requirements, permits, compliance checks, and inspections. Robert recognized that success required more than participation. It required insight into every facet of the system. He approached the project strategically. The family documented every decision, verified all contractor credentials, and cross-referenced city planning regulations. Marjorie coordinated schedules and payments, ensuring deadlines were met without errors. Evelyn tracked costs, calculated potential returns, and observed the social dynamics surrounding the project. Every member of the family was engaged in a complex, high-stakes lesson in leverage, timing, and systemic awareness. The initiative also introduced a social dimension. Neighbors began vying for influence over the project, some attempting to subtly sway decisions or gain preferential access. Robert recognized the importance of negotiation, diplomacy, and observation. Each interaction became a test of strategy: when to assert authority, when to yield tactfully, and when to rely on documented evidence rather than verbal assurances. By late summer, the project was underway. The Whittakers had secured approvals, contracts, and strategic leverage points. Returns were projected to be significant, but risk remained, a reminder that the system, indifferent yet omnipresent, could disrupt even the most carefully executed plans. In September, an unexpected challenge arose. A neighboring developer, noticing the Whittakers' growing influence, attempted to undercut their position by lobbying for restrictive zoning interpretations. Meetings with city officials became tense, and informal warnings suggested that oversight would be more rigorous than previously experienced. Robert understood immediately. Their advantage had now attracted the attention of other actors, each operating within the system to protect or advance their own interests. The Whittakers responded strategically. Robert met privately with planners, presenting detailed documentation and historical records. Marjorie coordinated household logistics, maintaining stability during periods of tension. Evelyn contributed insights from her observations, suggesting alternative approaches that preserved advantage while minimizing confrontation. Together, the family converted potential disruption into opportunity, reinforcing their position within both the neighborhood and the broader system. By winter, the first returns from the commercial project began to materialize. Revenue flowed steadily, property value increased, and the family's understanding of leverage, timing, and systemic influence deepened. Yet Robert remained vigilant. Advantage, he knew, was never permanent, and visibility ensured that challenges would continue. Each success, while tangible, brought new scrutiny, new competitors, and new potential disruptions. Evelyn, now approaching 17, had matured in her comprehension of wealth. She could anticipate market shifts, understand regulatory language, and recognize patterns in human behavior that most adults overlooked. Her questions had evolved. Why do some families always seem to anticipate change, while others react too late? Robert explained, emphasizing the combination of foresight, preparation, and calculated risk. a synthesis of knowledge and action that few truly mastered. The winter of 1990 brought broader economic turbulence. Regional job losses and industry slowdowns created uncertainty for families relying solely on income. The Whitakers, however, insulated through diversified investments, property advantage, and strategic foresight, navigated the disruption with relative stability. The lesson was clear. Financial resilience required not just earnings, but systemic understanding, adaptability, and foresight, yet the system continued to test. Minor disputes arose, contractor errors, permit delays, and small misinterpretations of municipal regulations, but the family had internalized the strategies necessary to manage them. Documentation, vigilance, and procedural knowledge converted potential setbacks into teachable moments. Every challenge reinforced the principle Robert had emphasized repeatedly. Knowledge and action, executed with precision, were the true instruments of generational advantage. In early 1991, Robert initiated a new principle, mentorship. Recognizing the growing complexity of opportunity, he began cultivating relationships with trusted advisors, contractors, and financial experts. These connections provided insight, early warnings of potential disruptions, and collaborative leverage that extended the family's influence. Evelyn, now nearly 17, became involved in these interactions, learning negotiation, diplomacy, and the subtleties of systemic dynamics. The Whitakers' influence, however, was becoming more visible. Other families began observing their methods, emulating small aspects of their approach, and even attempting to preempt opportunities. Robert understood this as a natural consequence of advantage, observation by peers, competition for scarce resources, and the amplification of scrutiny. He taught Evelyn to anticipate these reactions, to adapt strategy based on emerging patterns, and to recognize that visibility, while signaling success, also introduced new pressures. By the summer of 1992, the family had achieved a precarious equilibrium. Their property portfolio had appreciated, investments yielded steady returns, and their operational understanding of local systems was robust. Evelyn, now a young adult, could navigate legal, financial, and social complexities with competence. Marjorie remained the stabilizing force, ensuring household operations and emotional resilience. Robert had become both strategist and teacher, embedding lessons of observation, leverage, and timing into the next generation. Yet the currents remained dynamic. External observers, regulatory bodies, and competing actors continued to monitor the family's activities. Each success invited scrutiny. Each advantage drew attention. Robert recognized that visibility was both opportunity and risk, and that mastery over the currents required constant adaptation, strategic foresight, and unwavering discipline. Then a letter arrived, understated but precise, from the city's planning office. It indicated potential policy shifts that could affect both residential and commercial holdings in the area. The content was neutral, yet the implications were vast. Subtle changes could accelerate returns, delay projects, or introduce new compliance challenges. The Whitakers understood immediately. The system, patient and indifferent, was signaling a new phase. Robert gathered the family. "This is not a threat," he said. "It's a reminder. Every action, every decision, every observation now matters more than ever. Advantage has a price, vigilance." Evelyn, sitting quietly, absorbed the gravity of his words. "A system notices, watches, and tests us continuously," she said. "Exactly," Robert replied. "And our task is to convert that observation into foresight, into strategy. Every disruption, every challenge is data. Every advantage, every move is preparation for what comes next." The family paused, reflecting on a decade of cumulative learning. From the first modest investment to property renovations, careful documentation, and diversified financial strategies, every lesson had built a foundation of resilience and insight. Yet the currents of influence, oversight, and systemic observation were constant, reminding them that advantage, while real, required perpetual engagement. As the Whitakers considered the potential policy changes, Robert realized the stakes had shifted. Their visibility, competence, and accumulated advantage had drawn attention from broader forces. The next phase would test their strategic foresight, resilience, and ability to preserve gains in a system that rewarded insight and punished error without mercy. The family stood at a precipice, success and vulnerability intertwined, the currents of the system converging on them with deliberate precision. The early months of 1993 brought a sense of unease that the Whitakers could not ignore. Winter had receded, leaving streets glistening with spring rain, but the atmosphere around the family's property was tense, electric with subtle observation and unspoken competition. Robert had sensed it for weeks. The currents that governed advantage were shifting, and the family's visibility made them a focal point. The first concrete sign came in the form of a letter from a neighbouring developer. It was formal, neutral in tone, but the implications were unmistakable. Objections to planned expansions in the commercial zone, claims that minor procedural steps had been overlooked, and a veiled assertion that delays could be enforced. Most families would have panicked, reacting emotionally or defensively. The Whitakers, however, had learned to see such challenges as part of a larger system, both a test and an opportunity to convert pressure into leverage. Robert called a family meeting. Marjorie, attentive as ever, prepared notes and organised records. Evelyn, now 17, had grown into a sharp observer, tracking trends, analysing behaviour, and anticipating consequences with an acuity that often startled her parents. Robert explained the situation carefully. The objections were procedural, but the consequences could be substantial if mishandled. Advantage, he reminded them, always attracted attention, and attention often translated into subtle challenges that could ripple outward unpredictably. Over the next several days, the Whitakers meticulously reviewed every relevant document. Every permit, contractor receipt, and city correspondence was catalogued. The family began modelling potential scenarios: delays, fines, adjustments, and negotiations. Robert emphasised strategy over emotion. Every step had to be deliberate, every decision informed, every move aligned with both long-term objectives and systemic realities. Evelyn contributed actively, analysing timelines, projecting financial impact, and suggesting contingencies. Her ability to integrate data, human behaviour, and potential systemic responses demonstrated a level of sophistication rare for someone her age. Robert recognised that the lessons he had taught through years of observation, dialogue, and lived experience were now taking root in the next generation. This was the moment when knowledge became inheritance, not just in money, but in insight, judgment, and resilience. The family scheduled a meeting with city officials to clarify procedural requirements and ensure compliance. They arrived prepared, each document cross-referenced, every potential question anticipated. The officials were courteous but thorough, highlighting minor discrepancies that could be interpreted as violations. Robert responded calmly, presenting records, explaining the methodology behind every decision, and demonstrating the legitimacy of each action. Marjorie supported the presentation seamlessly, her attention to detail ensuring that nothing was overlooked. The outcome was a success. The city accepted their explanations, and the procedural challenges were resolved without penalty. Yet the encounter served as a stark reminder that visibility, competence, and advantage invariably attracted scrutiny. Every victory, no matter how carefully earned, carried latent risk. The Whitakers understood that the system was impartial but relentless, testing understanding, diligence, and adaptability with every shift in attention. By mid-1993, the family's property and investments had grown in value, but the environment was increasingly competitive. Other families, recognizing the Whitakers' success, began emulating their strategies, sometimes creating pressure through indirect competition or social friction. Robert taught Evelyn that observation was a tool. Understanding the motivations, patterns, and behaviours of others allowed anticipation of challenges and identification of opportunities that were invisible to most. Then came the most significant external test yet: a local economic shift triggered by a regional policy change. Property taxes increased across the neighbourhood, and commercial development approvals became more selective. Most families felt the pressure immediately, struggling to absorb the financial and procedural adjustments. The Whitakers, however, approached the shift analytically. Robert recalculated budgets, re-evaluated investment projections, and prepared a series of contingency plans. Marjorie coordinated household resources to ensure continuity, while Evelyn mapped potential outcomes and analysed risks at both micro and macro levels. The combination of preparation, foresight, and documentation allowed the Whitakers to navigate the economic shift without disruption. Sure. Returns continued, albeit with reduced margins, and property values stabilized rather than declining. The family had internalized a principle Robert emphasized repeatedly. Stability and growth were inseparable from awareness of systemic forces, strategic adaptation, and proactive decision-making. Despite success, the stress of visibility and ongoing scrutiny weighed heavily. Neighbors, developers, and municipal observers had now recognized the Whitakers as capable actors within the system, and every action was interpreted as signal or leverage. Robert noted the subtle social dynamics: envy, subtle resistance, and competitive mimicry. Advantage, he realized, could provoke as much challenge as opportunity. In the fall of 1994, the family began considering expansion into adjacent properties. "We must act strategically, anticipate outcomes, and remain vigilant." Evelyn, sitting beside him, nodded. "So every success now becomes a test," she said, "and not just of skill, but of foresight, judgment, and adaptability." Robert smiled, acknowledging her insight. "Exactly. The system doesn't reward luck or effort alone. It responds to knowledge, preparation, and the ability to anticipate invisible currents. That's the difference between surviving and thriving, and between fleeting gains and generational advantage." The family absorbed the weight of the lesson. Over a decade of deliberate, calculated effort had built resilience, insight, and advantage, but the system's attention ensured that their journey was far from over. Every choice, every action, every observation now had the potential to influence not only immediate outcomes, but the trajectory of generational wealth, influence, and security. As the Whitakers considered the implications of the City Council's policy adjustments, Robert realized that the next phase would test not just financial skill, but strategic foresight, social influence, and the ability to maintain advantage under the unblinking eye of a system that rewarded insight and punished error without mercy. The family's next moves would determine whether their decade of careful planning could withstand both external forces and the currents of systemic observation. The summer of 1995 was unusually warm, the sunlight glinting off the Whitakers' property as if to signal prosperity, yet Robert felt the tension beneath the surface. Advantage, he had learned, was never static. Visibility attracted both opportunity and scrutiny. The City Council's proposed zoning adjustments loomed large, subtle yet potent, capable of shifting the entire neighbourhood's landscape. Robert began reviewing the proposals in meticulous detail. Every clause, line, and subtext was analysed for potential impact. Permits, property boundaries, investment projections, and legal precedents were cross-referenced with the family's records. Marjorie coordinated schedules, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Evelyn, now 17 and a keen observer, analysed data patterns and tracked potential ripple effects. The family approached the challenge as a complex system, every variable interconnected, every decision consequential. The first significant confrontation arose in mid-July. A developer with interests in the neighbourhood questioned the Whitakers' planned expansion into adjacent properties. The objection was framed as concern for compliance, but Robert recognised the underlying motive: competition and a desire to test the family's response under pressure. Most families would have been intimidated. The Whitakers saw it as an opportunity to exercise the principles they had cultivated for over a decade. Robert scheduled a private meeting with the developer. He presented historical records, permits, and detailed documentation of every decision related to the properties in question. Marjorie managed logistics, ensuring that all documents were organised, and Evelyn contributed insights, pointing out potential leverage points in zoning rules and previous approvals. The negotiation was precise, calm, and rigorous. After hours of discussion, the developer relented, recognising that the Whitakers' preparation left little room for dispute. This victory reinforced a critical lesson: meticulous preparation, foresight, and strategic patience could convert potential disruption into advantage. Yet Robert reminded the family that every success, especially visible ones, attracted renewed attention. Advantage was a signal, and signals invited scrutiny. By late summer, the City Council began implementing portions of the proposed zoning adjustments. These changes introduced new procedural requirements, stricter compliance checks, and increased documentation standards. Many neighborhood families struggled, facing delays, fines, or lost opportunities. The Whitakers, insulated by preparation and vigilance, navigated the adjustments without disruption. Their property value continued to rise, investments remained steady, and the family's operational understanding of systemic dynamics deepened. Evelyn, observing the broader pattern, began to see lessons beyond property and finance. She noted how perception, influence, and timing shaped outcomes as much as numbers did. She asked questions her parents had long anticipated. Why do some people see the rules as obstacles while others see them as opportunities? Robert smiled. Because rules are neutral, they reward knowledge, preparation, and action, but punish error and ignorance. Understanding the system and anticipating its responses is more valuable than luck or brute effort. The family applied these principles actively. They began to diversify their influence, meeting with local officials, participating in neighborhood planning discussions, and documenting every interaction. Every social and regulatory connection became a data point, a potential lever for opportunity. Advantage, Robert taught, was amplified when knowledge intersected with influence, timing, and visibility. Most families might have ignored it or accepted an overcharge, but Robert saw it as a test. He reviewed every historical tax record, cross-referenced property evaluations, and consulted financial advisors. Through careful documentation and persistent follow-up, he resolved the discrepancy, securing a modest but significant financial benefit. Evelyn observed the process closely. She noted how small errors could accumulate into material loss, how documentation and foresight converted risk into opportunity, and how engagement with systems, rather than avoidance, was critical. Robert recognized this moment as pivotal. The lessons he had imparted were now internalized, ready to be applied independently. By winter of 1996, the neighborhood had transformed. The Whitakers' properties and investments were prominent, their methods widely observed, and their strategic visibility firmly established. Other families attempted to emulate aspects of their approach, but few succeeded. The combination of meticulous documentation, strategic foresight, and procedural vigilance was difficult to replicate. Yet with visibility came pressure. Social dynamics shifted subtly. Neighbors whispered about the Whitakers' advantage, some expressing envy, others skepticism. City officials, familiar with the family's track record, approached interactions with increased scrutiny. Robert recognized the dual nature of success. Every calculated gain was a signal, and every signal invited observation and challenge. In the spring, the family began considering expansion into another commercial parcel. This opportunity promised significant leverage, but it required navigating regulatory, financial, and social complexities simultaneously. Robert approached the decision methodically. Every potential scenario was modeled, every risk quantified, and every possible leverage point identified. Marjorie coordinated resources to ensure the household remained stable during intense periods of administrative and social engagement. Evelyn analyzed potential outcomes, preparing projections that highlighted both risks and opportunities. Negotiations with the new property owner were delicate. The owner, recognizing the Whitakers' competence and visibility, attempted to assert influence, testing boundaries and probing for weakness. Robert relied on preparation, evidence, and procedural knowledge. Marjorie maintained composure, ensuring that the family's approach remained calm and methodical. Evelyn contributed insights on negotiation strategy, highlighting potential concessions that could preserve advantage while maintaining leverage. Robert himself focused on strategy. Every interaction, every explanation, and every presentation of evidence had to reinforce credibility, minimize ambiguity, and preserve the family's advantage. The auditors arrived over several days, methodically reviewing the Whitakers' portfolio. Questions were precise, often probing minor procedural details. Each query was an opportunity. Robert reminded the family to demonstrate mastery, control, and foresight. The Whitakers responded with calm, comprehensive documentation, procedural clarity, and measured explanation. By the conclusion of the audit, the officials acknowledged the family's diligence and compliance, offering commendations that, while understated, signaled recognition of competence. The outcome reinforced a critical lesson. Advantage attracts observation, and observation tests resilience, preparation, and judgment. Every success, while tangible, carried implicit responsibility, and visibility amplified both opportunity and potential disruption. The Whitakers had navigated this phase successfully, but Robert remained cautious. The system's currents were indifferent, patient, and capable of testing endurance over time. Meanwhile, external social pressures were increasing. Other families, recognizing the Whitakers' growing influence, subtly challenged their methods, attempted to preempt opportunities, and circulated narratives questioning the family's intentions. These efforts were often indirect, misleading statements, procedural questioning, or ambiguous social signals, but they underscored a fundamental principle Robert had long emphasized. In any system where advantage is visible, social dynamics become an essential variable. Evelyn, observing these dynamics, began to apply lessons beyond finance. She documented interactions, analyzed social cues, and began anticipating patterns of behavior in peers, neighbors, and local actors. Robert recognized that her ability to integrate observation, analysis, and strategy mirrored the multi-dimensional approach he had cultivated over the years. Advantage was no longer merely financial. It encompassed social awareness, timing, and the capacity to interpret complex systems. By early 1998, the family identified a significant opportunity. A commercial property in a nearby district was undervalued due to procedural neglect and regulatory ambiguity. Most observers ignored the property, deterred by bureaucratic complexity. Robert saw potential. With careful analysis, strategic negotiation, and procedural diligence, acquiring the property could expand the family's portfolio, diversify returns, and increase influence in both neighborhoods. The acquisition process was delicate. Robert meticulously documented every step, anticipating regulatory scrutiny and social friction. Marjorie coordinated resources, ensuring operational continuity at home. Evelyn analyzed potential outcomes, modeling financial projections, procedural risks, and social reactions. Every action was deliberate, aligned with long-term strategic objectives, and informed by decades of cumulative insight. Negotiations with the property owner revealed the subtle interplay of leverage, perception, and timing. The owner, aware of the Whitakers' influence, attempted to assert advantage, probing for hesitation or error. Robert responded calmly, relying on thorough preparation, historical precedent, and procedural clarity. Marjorie's organizational precision and Evelyn's analytical projections reinforced the family's position. After weeks of careful negotiation, the acquisition was completed successfully, demonstrating the power of strategy, preparation, and foresight when applied in concert. Yet the success brought new challenges. Visibility intensified, scrutiny increased, and subtle competition arose from neighboring developers who perceived the Whitakers as a growing threat. The system, patient and indifferent, continued to test endurance, judgment, and strategic insight. Robert emphasized to the family that advantage, while cumulative, was never immune to disruption, and every new acquisition required renewed vigilance. In mid-98, the family faced another critical scenario. Regional policy changes introduced new taxation structures for commercial properties, altering projected returns and requiring recalibration of investment strategies. Many families struggled, reacting with reactive adjustments or ill-prepared negotiations. The Whitakers, however, applied their accumulated principles. They analyzed the legislation, projected financial implications, and identified leverage points to mitigate risk. Marjorie managed operational logistics, ensuring compliance and continuity, while Evelyn contributed insights into risk management and strategic adjustments. The family implemented a calculated response. Property allocations were adjusted, tax filings were optimized, and financial projections were updated. The system's currents had shifted, but preparation, foresight, and adaptation allowed the Whitakers to preserve advantage, demonstrating the practical value of multidimensional strategic awareness. By late 1998, the cumulative lessons of a decade were evident. The Whitakers' portfolio had diversified across residential and commercial properties, procedural competence was embedded in family operations, and generational knowledge had been transmitted successfully. Evelyn, now on the cusp of adulthood, had internalized principles of strategic observation, systemic awareness, and adaptive decision-making, ensuring that the family's advantage could persist across generations. However, the system remained indifferent. New challenges emerged, subtle yet consequential. City council meetings introduced minor procedural shifts, other families tested influence through indirect competition, and regulatory frameworks continued to evolve unpredictably. The Whitakers understood that their cumulative advantage required continuous engagement, careful observation, and adaptive action. In early 1999, the family identified a strategic opportunity that combined both financial and social leverage: participation in a local cooperative development initiative. The project promised not only returns but influence over broader neighborhood planning, allowing the Whitakers to shape systemic currents while preserving an expanding advantage. Robert explained the opportunity to the family. Participation required both careful documentation and strategic social engagement, aligning procedural compliance with influence building. The family approached the initiative methodically. Robert analysed legal frameworks and historical precedents. Marjorie coordinated logistical and financial resources, and Evelyn observed social dynamics, identifying patterns of negotiation, influence, and potential friction. Every step was deliberate, every decision informed, and every interaction approached with the precision that had become second nature. Participation in the cooperative project introduced new dimensions of systemic engagement. Meetings required negotiation, coalition building, and careful attention to perception. The Whitakers applied accumulated knowledge to anticipate challenges, leverage procedural insight, and align social influence with long-term strategic objectives. The result was a successful integration of both financial and social advantage, reinforcing the family's position and demonstrating the cumulative power of preparation, foresight, and systemic awareness. Yet, Robert remained cautious. Visibility had reached a new level. Scrutiny, competition, and procedural complexity intensified. Every decision carried amplified consequences, every action was observed, and every opportunity had embedded risk. Advantage, while significant, was now inseparable from responsibility, vigilance, and multidimensional strategic awareness. By the close of 1999, the Whitakers had accumulated substantial influence, both financial and social, yet the currents of the system had shifted again. External scrutiny, competition, and regulatory complexity converged on the family's activities, presenting a challenge that would test not only wealth and strategy, but the resilience, foresight, and adaptability of an entire generation. The next phase would determine whether the Whitakers could preserve their cumulative advantage under conditions of intensified observation and pressure. The first months of 2000 carried a crisp clarity. The neighborhood bathed in early sunlight, yet Robert felt the invisible weight pressing down. Advantage, he had learned over decades, was never secure. Visibility invited observation, and observation amplified consequence. The Whitakers had spent years cultivating a foundation of financial, procedural, and social competence. Yet the system was now converging on their activities with a focus that was both impartial and relentless. It began subtle. Notices arrived from the city council, highlighting minor but cumulative procedural shifts in zoning, commercial development, and residential compliance. These notices, seemingly routine, carried embedded complexity. Delays could ripple across multiple properties, slight missteps could trigger administrative reviews, and any error might provide leverage for competitors. Most families would have reacted with anxiety, overwhelmed by the layers of scrutiny. The Whitakers, however, treated each notice as data, signals to be interpreted, patterns to be anticipated, and opportunities to be leveraged. Robert convened a family meeting. Marjorie, organized and steady, prepared documentation and tracked timelines. Evelyn, now 20, compiled analysis of the notices, projecting potential outcomes and identifying leverage points. Robert emphasized strategy over reaction. The system observes relentlessly, he said. Every action, every decision, every oversight carries amplified consequence. Advantage now requires precision, foresight, and adaptive resilience. The first concrete challenge arose when a competitor questioned one of the Whitakers' recent commercial expansions, alleging procedural oversight. The claim was minor in substance, but strategically aimed to provoke delay and scrutiny. Robert recognized the pattern. Visibility, competence, and advantage naturally attracted testing by peers seeking leverage or validation of their own position. Preparation, he reminded the family, was the antidote. They reviewed every document, verified compliance with both historical and current regulations, and anticipated possible objections. Marjorie coordinated household operations to minimize disruption, ensuring that the family could respond efficiently. Evelyn analyzed competitor behavior, identifying patterns in negotiation tactics, procedural questioning, and social influence. The formal response to the competitor was methodical. Robert presented a comprehensive record of compliance, timelines, and procedural diligence. Every interaction, every explanation was framed to demonstrate competence without provocation. The competitor's challenge dissipated, but the episode underscored a persistent truth. Advantage is a signal, and signals attract scrutiny, competition, and subtle pressure. By spring, the family's visibility had expanded further. Invitations to neighborhood committees, planning councils, and advisory groups arrived, signaling recognition of their competence. Participation offered opportunity, but introduced new dimensions of responsibility and observation. Robert explained to Evelyn that influence was now inseparable from scrutiny. The family's decisions would shape not only their own advantage, but also the expectations and perceptions of others. Evelyn, absorbing the lesson, began to see the intersection of finance, regulation, and social dynamics. She tracked the behavior of peers, officials, and competitors, noting how patterns of observation, influence, and timing shaped outcomes. Advantage, she realized, was a multi-dimensional construct. Wealth, procedural competence, social influence, and timing all converged in complex interaction. By mid-2000, the Whitakers faced a particularly high-stakes scenario. A neighboring developer, previously neutral, had consolidated resources and sought influence over zoning decisions that directly affected the family's portfolio. The developer's strategy was subtle, leveraging procedural ambiguity, social influence, and timing to create pressure. Robert recognized that the family was entering a phase where both visibility and cumulative advantage would be tested against coordinated external forces. The family responded strategically. Robert analyzed historical precedents, modeled multiple scenarios, and identified points of leverage. Marjorie ensured that resources, schedules, and documentation were aligned to respond efficiently to both procedural and social pressures. Evelyn applied her observational skills to track patterns of influence, anticipate potential moves, and propose strategic interventions. The family's approach was holistic, combining financial analysis, procedural mastery, and social intelligence. Negotiations and administrative interactions stretched over weeks. Every meeting, every document, and every decision carried weight. The competitor attempted to exploit minor procedural ambiguities, tested social influence, and sought to create perceived vulnerability. Robert, Marjorie, and Evelyn responded with precision. Evidence-based arguments, proactive engagement, and anticipatory adjustments to both strategy and perception. By late summer, the immediate threat had been neutralized, reinforcing the principle that preparation, foresight, and adaptive strategy were the most reliable instruments of advantage. Yet Robert remained vigilant. He knew that systemic attention was continuous. Every success intensified observation, every decision amplified consequence. Visibility was both a reward and a challenge, and the family's multi-generational advantage depended on their ability to maintain vigilance without succumbing to fatigue or complacency. In autumn, an unexpected opportunity emerged. A regional initiative aimed at promoting sustainable commercial development introduced favorable zoning adjustments, tax incentives, and procedural facilitation for projects that met specific criteria. Most families ignored the initiative, daunted by regulatory complexity or skeptical of potential benefits. Robert immediately recognized the strategic significance. Early engagement could expand influence, secure financial advantage, and position the family as leaders in a new phase of development. The family responded decisively. Robert reviewed legal and regulatory documentation, Marjorie coordinated implementation logistics, and Evelyn analysed projected outcomes and risk mitigation. Every detail, from application timing to procedural documentation and social engagement, was managed with precision. Participation not only expanded the family's portfolio but also reinforced multi-dimensional influence across financial, regulatory, and social dimensions. By the end of 2000, the Whitakers had solidified their position. Their residential and commercial properties had appreciated, investments were diversified, and procedural and strategic competence was embedded in family operations. Evelyn, now fully integrated into decision-making processes, demonstrated mastery of multi-dimensional strategy, combining observation, analysis, and anticipatory action. Yet the currents remained relentless. External scrutiny, competition, and systemic evolution continued to shape the landscape. Robert emphasized to the family that advantage, while substantial, was never permanent. It required continuous engagement, adaptive resilience, and strategic foresight. Every success carried implicit responsibility, and every visibility amplified consequence. Late in the year, a final challenge emerged. The City Council proposed sweeping adjustments to commercial and residential zoning regulations, affecting not only the Whitakers' properties but the broader neighbourhood. The adjustments promised both opportunity and risk. Early comprehension and strategic positioning could yield amplified returns, but oversight or misinterpretation could undermine years of accumulated advantage. Robert gathered the family. "This is the ultimate test of what we've built," he said. "Every principle we've cultivated, preparation, foresight, vigilance, strategic observation, will be applied now. We must act with precision, anticipation, and clarity." Evelyn, observing the documents and projections, recognized the gravity of the moment. "Also, everything we've done, every lesson, every investment, every negotiation, prepares us for this," she said. "Exactly," Robert replied. "Advantage is cumulative, but the system tests durability. This is our moment to apply what we've learned, to preserve and expand what we've built, and to demonstrate the resilience of multi-generational strategy." As the family prepared to engage with the City Council, competitors, and regulatory observers, Robert reflected on the journey. A decade of careful observation, strategic action, and intergenerational instruction had built substantial advantage, yet the system remained patient and relentless. Every opportunity carried potential disruption, every success drew scrutiny, and every decision now carried amplified consequence. The Whitakers stood at the threshold of their most significant test yet. The proposed zoning adjustments, combined with intensified scrutiny from competitors and regulatory authorities, would challenge not only wealth and strategy, but the family's capacity for foresight, adaptability, and multi-generational resilience. Their next moves would determine whether a decade of careful preparation could withstand the converging pressures of systemic observation, competition, and evolving opportunity. The winter of 2001 arrived with an unusual stillness, the neighbourhood blanketed in frost that seemed to quiet not only streets but the currents of observation Robert had long described. Yet beneath the surface, the system remained vigilant, impartial, and patient. Advantage, cultivated over a decade, now faced its most rigorous test. The Whitakers had prepared meticulously for this moment, but preparation alone would not guarantee success. The convergence of financial, procedural, and social forces demanded precision, adaptability, and clarity. The City Council convened hearings to implement the zoning adjustments, inviting developers, property owners, and neighbourhood stakeholders to provide input. The Whitakers approached the hearings as they had approached every challenge, with evidence, strategy, and anticipation. Robert organised documentation, Marjorie coordinated schedules, and Evelyn, now fully integrated into decision-making, analysed potential scenarios, identifying risks and opportunities at every stage. From the opening session, the intensity was clear. Competitors, previously neutral, now attempted to exert influence, framing arguments around minor procedural ambiguities and subtle appeals to equity and precedent. Officials were attentive, weighing every statement, document, and procedural nuance. The Whitakers' preparation allowed them to respond calmly, presenting comprehensive records, historical context, and anticipatory strategies for each objection. Every interaction was deliberate, measured, and aligned with long-term strategic objectives. The hearings stretched over weeks. The project required coordination with city officials, contractors, and neighborhood stakeholders, balancing multiple dimensions of risk and opportunity. Every detail, from contract negotiation to procedural documentation, was handled with precision. The initiative succeeded, producing both measurable financial returns and intangible strategic advantage. The family's influence was now robust, multi-generational, and deeply integrated into the systemic landscape they had navigated for years. During the project, Evelyn reflected on the lessons of the past decade. Observation, preparation, and strategy had been central, but the true insight was the interplay of human behavior, systemic forces, and procedural competence. Wealth was not merely accumulation, it was the capacity to anticipate, influence, and adapt within a complex network of social and regulatory dynamics. Advantage, she understood, was both a result of action and a catalyst for responsibility, visibility, and ongoing engagement. The family gathered one evening to review the decade's trajectory. Robert spoke first, emphasizing that the Whitakers' journey had never been merely about financial success. Every decision, every observation, every calculation was part of a larger system, he said. We've learned that advantage requires foresight, preparation, and adaptability. It is cumulative, fragile, and amplified by visibility. Marjorie added, it's also about resilience. Wealth, strategy, and influence are meaningless if we cannot maintain stability, composure, and clarity under scrutiny. Evelyn, now fully confident in her understanding, concluded, and it's about perspective, seeing patterns others miss, anticipating currents, and converting challenges into opportunity. Advantage isn't given, it's created, sustained, and defended across generations. As the evening settled into quiet reflection, Robert recognized the culmination of their efforts. A decade of strategic preparation, procedural diligence, and generational instruction had produced not only financial wealth but resilience, influence, and insight. The Whitakers had navigated systemic currents, converted challenges into advantage, and transmitted knowledge across generations. They had achieved not merely success, but sustainable, multi-dimensional advantage. The Whitakers' journey demonstrated that wealth, influence, and resilience are inseparable from preparation, observation, and adaptive strategy. Visibility amplifies opportunity and scrutiny alike. Advantage is cumulative but fragile. Foresight and adaptability are essential for long-term preservation. The family's story illustrated the interdependence of finance, procedure, and social dynamics, revealing the unseen currents that govern systemic success. Through deliberate action, intergenerational teaching, and meticulous engagement with both tangible and intangible variables, the Whitakers had not only accumulated wealth, but cultivated a framework for sustainable advantage. Their journey underscores a fundamental principle in a complex, interconnected system. Success is not measured by income alone, but by the capacity to anticipate, adapt, and preserve advantage across generations. By 2002, the Whitakers had solidified a foundation that would endure far beyond the immediate decade. Their influence, wealth, and procedural mastery were now deeply integrated, providing not only financial security, but the cognitive and social tools to navigate future challenges. The family story is a testament to the power of preparation, foresight, and multi-dimensional strategy, a narrative of resilience, insight, and the enduring impact of generational knowledge. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the carefully maintained properties, Robert, Marjorie, and Evelyn reflected on a journey defined by vision, discipline, and cumulative insight. The currents of the system, once unpredictable, were now navigated with confidence, and the Whitakers had not only survived but thrived, demonstrating that advantage, when cultivated strategically, can endure across generations, shaping not only wealth but the very dynamics of opportunity, influence, and resilient family, unified, resilient, and informed, stood poised to navigate the future with clarity, foresight, and strategic insight. Proof that generational wealth, in both tangible and intangible forms, is built not merely through earnings, but through observation, preparation, and the disciplined application of knowledge across time.